Good afternoon, everyone. So as I mentioned in the main room, my name is Shanaz Deen. I'm the Racial Justice Advocacy Fellow, and I'm super excited to be facilitating this workshop entitled Towards Food Sovereignty, a Racial Justice Perspective. Um, I feel confident in saying that many of us have engaged in food justice work, whether that be with SNAP benefits or food pantries, community fridges, etc. But rarely do we have the opportunity to think about the history and institutions, the systems that underlie and sustain the level of food insecurity that we see in our city and across the world. So this workshop aims to not only highlight how food intersects race, class, gender, among other identities, but to also think creatively of how we can transform our solutions, relationships with each other and the environment. How do we move beyond basic food access to food sovereignty, in which all groups, especially those historically marginalized, have access and ownership over a sustainable and culturally appropriate food system? So with that, I'm super eager to jump into a few questions with our panel. We have Kelly Moltzen with the Interfaith Public Health Network, Ora Wise with FIG, the Food Issues Group, and Tanika Williams. So even as I ask a couple questions, I encourage you all to keep engaging with each other in the chat, ask a few questions, which we'll have 10 to 15 minutes towards the end to explore. So with that, Tanika, would you mind starting us off a little and share a little bit about the historical practices of food justice you've encountered in the framework of New York City and how we can draw on these historical cases to transform our current efforts for food sovereignty?
Good morning. Thank you, everyone, or good afternoon. To start, I just want to acknowledge that I sit here on the grace and generosity of those who have come before me. I am 6 generations deep of women who made decisive actions about the well-being of their family, and in the process made sure that they centered plants and food. And it is an honor to continue to move forward with this work with my own children and in community. So I want to start by also acknowledging that though we sit here as people, plants are also an integral part of our ecosystems and we can't exist without them. And Stephen Mancuso, a biologist, wrote a book called The Incredible Journey of Plants, in which he said that plants are colonies and people are individuals. However, I counter that we too are colonies, and in each of us, we carry the memories, the bodies, the lived and metaphysical and metaphorical experiences of countless of other ancestors before us. And it's also my child's nap time, and so she's on my lap, and you will hear her cooing and sometimes making other noise. So thank you for holding space for her as well. In the chat, I posted a link to a map, and the map, it's a bit small, but essentially it is an exercise in mapping freedom. So let's see if I can actually do a share screen. Am I allowed to? Can you all see that map up there? Yeah. Can I get a thumbs up? Is it just the map? Okay, great. So this project is part of a larger series called Founding Freedom, and it seeks to understand how within the context of New York City, communities have always worked toward liberation and have done so in right relationship with our environment in order to build a more inclusive ecosystem. And so this particular project traces the Underground Railroad, some of the sites that were right here in downtown Brooklyn, or pardon me, I'm in Brooklyn. I'm sure people are coming in from many places. And the goal was to highlight the ways in which these particular locations played a role in the memory of the place and how it's connected through an uninterrupted thread from this time all the way through the present. And so we looked at sites like Plymouth Church on 75 Hicks Street. That was an actual Underground Railroad, one of the main Underground Railroad locations in Brooklyn. We looked at places like 227 Duffield Street, also known as Abolitionist Place. And that is an example of a building that was preserved by a member of the community who lived there so that we could all benefit. We looked at Juneteenth Grove, which was recently renamed and repurposed during the Black Lives Matter movements post-COVID or post-2020, and we look at Columbus Park, a place that sits between or sits at the intersection of statues of, well, commemorations to Korean War veterans and statues of Christopher Columbus, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, Henry Beecher, and also Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And at each of these sites, a tribute was left to ancestors in the form of plants, those plants being mugwort, echinacea, dandelion, and yarrow, and thinking about the ways in which people actually sustained themselves physically in the process of these freedom movements. And I highlight these because oftentimes when we talk about movements and food access, we don't actually think about people eating, right? We don't think about the physical act of taking something that exists outside of oneself and placing it inside oneself in order to nourish you and sustain the works that you're doing. And so this was an attempt to call to action the places where people have walked and the things that have sustained them along the way, whether they are medicinal plants or whether they are plants that are also used for food. In my work, I often frame the question around who fed Harriet Tubman, right? Because we have a tendency to mythologize historical figures as if they are not real people, as if they did not need to eat. And in thinking about the work of food justice in New York City specifically, oh, it's okay. In thinking about the work of food justice in New York City specifically, it is so crucial to highlight faith-based programs such as Brooklyn Rescue Mission that attempt to really connect people to food and gardening spaces as well. You know, I remember they have a fig tree, and I'm actually not sure if they still have it, in the backyard of Brooklyn Rescue Mission. And there were times when they would open the gates and people could come and play under the fig tree. And so what does it mean when our faith-based initiatives also are stewards of the land? And so it's not just a matter of feeding people, right, through our ministries, but it's a matter of feeding people through our abilities to ground ourselves in the world around us. And in New York City, particularly, there are movements going back to the Harlem Renaissance that centered feeding people. There are movements throughout the Bronx connected to the Young Lords and other parties that centered around feeding people. So the notion of feeding people is not new. But I challenge us to think about what it means to intentionally connect people to food and historical movements, whether it is helping young people understand that there were restaurants in the South that actually made sandwiches to deliver them to individuals who were protesting, right? That was a restaurant owner's choice to say, I am going to open up my doors, or establishments that chose to have things like chicken dinners in order to raise funds for the movements, or people like the poet Sonia Sanchez, who lived in East Harlem and made it a point to write to and speak to the neighborhood institutions to say, I need better quality food, right? And so there are these large ways in which we interact with people under the guise of food justice. But it's important to let communities know about the smaller ways that we can make an impact. And often the best ways I find to help people understand that is simply pointing them to the flower that is unassuming and growing along the roadside, but is used to induce sleep or used to stop bleeding, or different ways in which our ancestors understood how relationships with plants were essential to nurturing not just us internally in terms of aspects of beauty, but also internally in terms of aspects of healing. Thank you.
Ora and Kelly, feel free to jump in and kind of respond to Tanika's presentation. Amazing presentation, of course.
Sure. Well, I can just share a bit. I mean, I don't know how familiar people are with this, just the concepts of colonization and how it's aligned with the history of industrialization of the food system. But, you know, our entire food system is based on this model of colonization, which, you know, and slavery. And, these issues have perpetuated throughout time and lead to the disparities that we have today in terms of, Black farmer access to land, and even the, being in areas of the food swamps and, food deserts, and inequitable access to healthy foods. So I think it's important to recognize that, and to recognize that this was a system designed that way. And even after World War II, in the meal that reconnects Eucharistic eating in the global food system, the author talks about how after World War II, a group of powerful American economists and businessmen basically created the food system that we have today, that is very consolidated, small number of corporately owned industrialized farms. It makes processed foods dominate the market, and cheap foods, and that's what's accessible. And we need to recognize this in order to pave our way out of this system, and to think about what is the system that we do want to have that isn't dependent on this industrial food system. And I just want to also highlight the work of Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter in his book, The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, as he goes a lot more deeply into a lot of these topics as well.
Would you also mind, you mentioned, the health disparities you have. Could you detail a bit about what our current landscape looks like? What does food insecurity look like in New York City, and specifically how it might intersect race and class?
Yeah, so actually, glad to have the question ahead of time, because I was able to put a couple of these slides together just to say that, sorry, I don't know how to make it, so, oh, there you go. Okay, so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, every year they put out this county health rankings report, and it ranks all the counties. So for New York State, the Bronx consistently ranks last in health outcomes and health factors in New York State, and then the rest of New York City isn't as bad. You have Brooklyn and Staten Island in the 20s, and then the best health is in Queens and Manhattan. And then if we compare that to the food security rates, you can see also the highest food insecurity is in the Bronx as well. A little bit less in the other boroughs, but still high in like Brooklyn and somewhat in Manhattan. And then if we compare that to, sorry, it's not going to my next, okay. If we compare these pieces to each other, the health disparities and food insecurity, generally the higher the food insecurity, the higher the health disparities. There is a large disproportionate disparity for the Bronx. It's a little bit different of a case in Manhattan. There is high food insecurity and a little bit less of the health disparities. And then also high health disparities in Staten Island as well. And just to compare that to the race in New York City and the poverty, so we can see here the overall rates for poverty in each borough is in blue, and then the rates among those who are Black and Hispanic and Latino are high. They have high poverty rates compared to those who are white, who are not Hispanic and Latino. So you can definitely see racial disparities in terms of the poverty, which also aligns with the health disparities and the food insecurity. So that's why a lot of my work in public health and food justice has been in the Bronx to try and address many of these disparities.
I can jump in here to kind of maybe bridge the systemic oppression and relationship between racialized capitalism and health inequity that Kelly just shared, and the rich legacy of resistance and collective wisdom around healing and nourishment. So I'm able to share my screen, yes?
Yeah, you should have sharing capabilities.
That so as was mentioned before, I'm a part of FIG, which is a New York City-based collective of people, of farmers, chefs, and other people working in and around food and hospitality, that are doing system transformation work and solidarity economy work and mutual aid. And one of the things that feels relevant to share here is that we found ourselves doing emergency food relief. We find ourselves in partnerships with communities experiencing food insecurity and in food apartheid neighborhoods and regions, needing to do survival work, right? Needing to focus on food distribution and food access. And we want to do that in a way that is not just pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it. Right. So, and also, and this is why I am going to share my screen, because I personally find it easier. Can you, oops, sorry, I'm having a, do you see this? Yes. I need to change the view. Sorry.
It's very small.
Yeah.
There it is.
There we go. Okay, so we can look at that information that that Kelly shared, and our institutions, whether they're faith-based institutions or social service agencies or community organizations, we can respond to that in ways that uphold the current power structure and inequities, both material and kind of social capital inequities, or we can work to transform them. So I just want to touch briefly on, this is a infographic prepared by our fellow travelers, the Food Culture Collective, kind of just breaking down how white supremacy culture narratives play out often in, both for-profit and nonprofit food system work. And they can often uphold the individualism and paternalism and neoliberalism, focus on charity, or these very Eurocentric and classist definitions of good or bad food, not listening to communities about their experience, or, as Tanika was sharing, their rich histories of being able to care for themselves despite everything, right? And not having that lead the response. Or we can respond in ways that are based on our values and what we know can transform the system, structurally, mutualism, belonging, and reciprocity. So for us, the food distribution work that we do is striving always to be based on these values. That first and foremost, food is relational. And also that care is the essence of all labor, and that we need to be doing this work in horizontal partnership. We really strive to do the work that we do, set up the programs and the partnerships and the events and the meetings and everything, to really be based on an understanding that we're comrades in this. There's no providers and receivers or helper and helped. We're all of our lives are being seriously transformed by the food security program that we run in partnership with Brooklyn Grange Rooftop Farm and ARV Suites, which is a Mexican family Sunset Park based catering and company and bakery, and Colectivo Intercultural Transgrediendo, which is a trans-led Central and South American immigrant community organization based in Queens. This feels like the bridge between what Tanika was sharing and what Kelly was sharing. Looking at the legacy, even if we just focus just on one of the more still marginalized in our formal histories, but definitely one of the more well-known examples of survival programs of food access work being done by the people whose community is being affected by food insecurity. And so we are really influenced by the model that was developed by the Black Panthers. And one of the things that feels important is that the breakfast program, which, you know, a lot of people know about, was part of a whole suite of survival programs with explicit goals of transforming relations around private property, right? So they were going deeper than just one free meal for one individual, but looking at building collective wellness and collective wealth. So the vision of a land bank, for instance, working on land reform, there was that collective health and wealth, and that structural change, and that generating resources, real resources and ownership for the community, might begin in a free breakfast, but did not end there. And so that is one of the things that distinguished its food distribution program, that it was part of a wider vision for social change. So for us, we take that legacy, and we think about survival programs pending political revolution, as the Panthers put it. And so for us, just a concrete example is that we worked with Transgrediendo to raise money to set up a kind of kitchen cafe space in their center in Jackson Heights. And they have a fridge now and a microwave and table and chairs, and there's like the food pantry shelves, but also we deliver weekly individually packaged prepared meals, because the weekly fresh produce that our farm partners are providing, not everyone, people with unstable housing, people coming out of detention centers or living in the shelter system, are not able to obviously cook and eat those veggies so as reliably. So in one of our monthly partner meetings, through which we make sure that we're co-creating and changing our food security program together, with the Transgrediendo organizers, the farmers, the chefs, they brought us that feedback that they thought that they had this vision of having a kind of drop-in center space so that the members could come and not just get individually packaged prepared meal that they could take back to the shelter if they needed to, but also if they could and wanted to actually sit down and amongst comrades, amongst people who share their experience in a safe space, and warm the food up and eat it there. So that is just an example of how this very simple food distribution work can also be done in ways that build community and build ownership. And so this is kind of our way of breaking that down, that we also know that you know, it doesn't serve our goals of a more equitable and sustainable and cooperative local food system to only engage in the most seemingly radical activism without addressing just people need hot meals today. We need to get groceries to folks. So we do that food access work to meet people's immediate needs in ways that, which is a form of redistributing resources, people's food, time, money, labor. Also, we do it in a way that we strive for double impact, that the money we raise is used to source from local and sustainable producers and from farmers and chefs who are really committed to community. So we're, for one, making sure that the food that we provide to our partners and our communities we work with is fresh and nutritious, and was created in line with our values, and we're supporting our values aligned producers here, which I think is what you could do a whole workshop on, the challenges of sourcing for food access work, right? And having that being able to afford the food that is in line with the values. But we're doing that in ways that build food security, developing long-term solutions at like the drop-in center, for instance, that we just talked about, but also figuring out generating opportunities for meaningful work. And then we are looking at food sovereignty, which involves self-governance and a thriving culture. And so how that has looked is we've been able to start this year, we launched a pilot series of culinary workshops, 1 month-long series, all in Spanish, with Latinx cooks and food workers working with members of Transgrediendo in weekly classes, so that there could be more ownership of their ability to feed themselves, and also figuring out ways to build skills for self-reliance, and to, for instance, figure out ways to incorporate the vegetables that they were getting through our food security program from Brooklyn Grange Rooftop Farm into familiar and culturally resonant dishes. So I'll pause there for now, but those are some of the ways that we're trying to do this work in a model that is based on the leadership of people whose labor and land and food traditions have been exploited and or destroyed, as was mentioned, through the industrialized food system and colonialism here, but also still really being practical and doing work that is needed on the daily.
Thank you so much for that. That was such an excellent presentation. And I really kind of want to continue building off of your example of the Black Panther parties, and how they, centered food distribution as one of their primary tools for, building their community and building capacity and power among people. And I'd love for you guys to kind of keep building on that and thinking of ways, how do we think of food as means for collective healing, for collective resistance? How can we transform our current system so they do that liberatory work?
I think it's largely around making sure that the people that have historically been marginalized from the food system have the ownership. I know that's something that Corbin Hill Food Project has been focusing on a lot, to make sure that they're sourcing from Black farmers and as much as possible, as well as making sure that the food is accessible in the communities of need in New York City, and even having a sliding scale for that food when possible, so that it's affordable for people, and while still making sure that the farmers are getting paid, living wages. And also the Black Church Food Security Network has a really good model. They started down in the Baltimore area, but just, growing food and recognizing like the power that there is in connecting to the land, and being able to heal from that, the history of, I think within the African American community, there is like a trauma associated with growing food, and there are groups like, probably like the Black Panthers and others I know that have begun this healing and reconnecting with the land. And that's something that everyone really needs to do. I know Catholic Rural Life, they do this sort of work in thinking about what does it look like to have a spiritual relationship with the land, and how can we do more of that? And also I mentioned Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter's book, In the Spirit of Soul Food, and he talks about this idea of Black veganism as a way that he has come over a long period of time, really to see it as a way of healing from this way that has been forced upon communities, that is not it doesn't treat the earth and people and even non-human animals as sacred. So as a way of pushing back against that, he puts forward these ideas around the Black veganism and soulful eating, as he calls it, and he talks about what we need for this decolonial theological anthropology around self-love and healing from trauma, and emptying oneself of colonial assumptions, as well as solidarity and holistic interdependence, seeing ourselves as all interconnected with the earth. So yeah, I think those are some of the ways that we can do, and just really look to see how we can fill the gaps between an emergency food system, and how do we actually end hunger, and how do we get to the point of this liberation and of the food sovereignty by really reconnecting back to the land and our interconnectedness, and recognizing that religious observances around food, like kosher and halal, there's practical reasons why these rules were created within the religions. And if we do return back to food that is coming straight from the ground, straight from the earth, and our creator as much as possible, then it's by default makes it easier to observe these practices, and it's also healthy and better for the environment as well.
So if I may, thank you for that, Kelly. One of the things so I actually did not introduce myself. I sit on the board for Just Food, but I'm primarily an artist and an activist. And I came to this work by way of food. And so my father was very involved in community movements in Jamaica connected with Cuba. And so during the 70s, my father was one of the individuals who helped to increase literacy in certain communities, who helped to bring the concept of community gardens to areas in Kingston, Jamaica. And so my relationship to plants from my maternal line has been one of love and reverence. My mom is such a big fan of trees, to put it lightly. And then my father was thinking about these things very much in relationship to power structures and how community can take things into their own hands. And so as someone who's been doing this work for over 20 years, the thing that I almost encourage people is start with your own story. I think a lot of the reasons why these movements fail in community is, quite frankly, people come into communities as though people have not already figured things out for themselves, A, and B, as though, even though these things are very heavily funded, a lot of the government programs have assessment models that are functional. I joke constantly in my family about how nonsensical the USDA guidelines are, and how on one hand, they'll advise you against eating something that is actually beneficial. And then when they figure out a way to monetize it, then they're shoving it down everyone's throats, right? Avocados, for example. I was talking with my mom yesterday about how in Jamaica, we have something called Irish moss, which is really sea moss, and how there is a way in which it's mixed and is given to babies who have issues with formula, right? But leave it up to the American government and then nutrition advisors and public health officials. They're going to tell someone that that's not the right way to do it until they figure out a way to make it something that's systematically widely applicable, right? When we are not going to sit here and pretend like corporations like Nestle did not receive a lot of funding to send formula into communities to have women breastfeeding their babies without formula feeding their babies without telling them that the water needed to be sanitized first, and causing all of these issues. And so I think that one of the best things that we can do in this food work is first center people and their stories. So Pepper Pot from Guyana or Guyana, depending on where you are from, uses local pepper in order to cook down actually the nutritionally dense parts of meats to make it into a stew so that people have something that is sustainable and collagen rich. The thing that people pay money for in these expensive bottles, communities have been doing. Somebody said ackee and codfish from Jamaica. Well, during enslavement, Atlantic cod was given as portions to people all throughout the Atlantic coastline. And you have saltfish being reinterpreted in many ways. In Jamaica, saltfish or codfish, which is here, was paired by ackee, brought over from Ghana, and people made a way out of nothing. People figured this out for themselves. Someone said applesauce from locally grown apples. Absolutely. If that is part of your childhood and that is something that is a memory and is relevant, these are things that are sustainable for you. A lot of the reason why food movements fail is that people come in with models that don't make sense in the communities, right? We are trying to force food pyramids down people's throats that don't work, right? A glance at the American system can tell you that these food pyramids do not work. Even if you take processed foods off the table, the food pyramids do not work. Communities understand what to do to make themselves feel better. The term food desert, I hate that term. There is no food desert in New York City. It is grossly inaccurate if you look at the actual standards by the people who came up with the metric. Food in New York City happens across a multitude of sectors in many different ways. And if you are not a member of that community, you will not know what that looks like. Right? These movements fail because they are not movements created by members of the community. And nobody wants to eat the food because it's not culturally relevant, right? Food, first and foremost, has to be in a relationship. And so a lot of the work that I do simply ask people to start with, who are you? Where are you from? What is your story? What did your ancestors eat? Talk about them and leave mine alone. Let me talk about mine. Right? And in many years of doing this work, ironically, the people who can oftentimes tell you what their ancestors ate and know how to prepare it are people of color. Very rarely have I ever come across someone who is doing this work, who's not a person of color, and can name their ancestry, who can go back generations. Let's start there first, right? Who are your people? This is an interfaith conference. Where is spirit and spirituality here? How do you receive something and are nourished by someone when spirit is absent? One of the most beautiful testimonies I saw, a woman talking about how she just had extra food and was just giving it to this person. And it turns out that every time she offered that person food, they did not have enough food to feed their children. There was never a conversation, just generosity of spirit. And until our food movements are built from this place of generosity of spirit, it will be nothing more than someone's self-interest playing out in a community. And I say this because we're at an interfaith conference. This is a place where it's supposed to be said. This is a faith-based movement. This is where the conversation belongs. Like, bring faith back here. That's my 2 cents, my soapbox, my apologies.
No, but
So
that was
brilliant.
essential. That's essential because you're right. You know, this is a conference where we should be talking from both the spiritual aspect of what we need to be doing as brothers and sisters to help our brothers and sisters in need, and also how we can best support and bring in food. You know, I heard that term for years. Harlem is a food desert, and it's almost more out of choice than, or maybe out of ignorance, than out of the lack of produce available in the community. People choose not to buy, you know, people continue to prefer a bodega and older produce, if any, than fresh fruit and vegetable. I think it has a lot to do with the education, as we've been talking about for most of the day. People just need to be more not only informed, but educated on fruit and vegetable. And a key piece that you said, I was at a conference maybe a couple of years ago now, and the lady was saying from the various regions, a lot of the Caribbean people may have grown up drinking goat milk as opposed to cow milk or something like that. And eating food, that's what your body's used to. That's where your genetics and everything, heredity, has come from. But we've twisted up as we kind of migrated together. So maybe we need to look at that again. But great comments, though.
Yeah, it's been such a brilliant discussion. And in our last 5 to 10 minutes, I do want to open it up to the audience. Feel free to come off mute and ask questions to our amazing panelists.
I'd love to just thank all of you on the panel first and foremost. But Charles, thank you for your comments there just a minute ago. I've been involved with the Interfaith Center since it was founded in 1997. Started there as a staff member for a couple of years after I'd left a for-profit job downtown in Manhattan. But one thing that's just been the steady, ever-growing feature of being involved with the center has been to experience firsthand gathering for food with the religious diversity of New York City, and what those times together have meant in terms of gaining further understanding that just doesn't come across in being spoken at or even just having some good panel discussions sometimes. So to have this Marshall Meyer retreat focused on what it has focused on has been a great way to see, I suppose one might say, the big picture of the keynote speaker this morning from New York City, but then to learn about FIG. I had not heard of FIG before. Great to look at your website and appreciate what you've all been doing or what you described you are doing. And Kelly, I'd heard a little bit about the Interfaith Public Health Network, but it's been great to have you and a couple of colleagues involved today to really deepen a little bit the awareness of it. And Tanika, I lived in Brooklyn the first 7-8 years. I was in New York City, and it was know those locations. It's great to hear about the some of the areas that have been designated to try to raise awareness of the way you are being an activist. So, but food has really been the central theme of my overall experience, I think.
That actually, I just want to pop in real quick to lift up how our collective talks about radical hospitality, which as a Jew coming into, FIG is a multiracial collective, but me individually, my tradition is not in the church, but in that faith tradition. But when I started to study radical hospitality more, seeing it amongst radical Christian spaces. And so that has been a really rich intersection for us, because we're not a faith-based collective, but we all do carry, as Tanika was saying, our different spiritual traditions, and we are very committed to doing this work as whole humans and addressing whole humans, and also social healing, which is sometimes just different language, whether you're talking about spirit or social healing, that it's about this full human connection and healing and empowerment and transformation. And so I just wanted to lift up that for us who are food workers, that interesting overlap of radical hospitality and the different ways that it means things is actually has been really cool for us. And especially because the point is that, as Tanika said, we're trying to create new, we're rejecting the conventional metrics that measure our quote unquote success or impact by pounds of food delivered or individual meals served, knowing that is not how wellness works and how, healing works or wealth is, works. So I just wanted to acknowledge that connection and shared concepts between our different kind of strands of the movement.
And another example of the radical hospitality in New York City was with Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. She founded that as a way to, feed the hungry. And she also established it with Peter Morin, who had, established a Peter Morin farm in upstate New York as a way to directly connect the food from upstate New York, the rural farms to New York City so that they could feed the people. And it was challenging for them to run the house and the farm at the same time, but they did have that vision of connecting the rural and the urban together and being directly connected to the land. So it's important to keep that in mind too.
I think one of the things that I wanted to say too, Tanika, you made excellent points. And I think that oftentimes we don't look at the community itself and the culture and what are the methods they use, whether it's related to food, to medical treatment, etc., because we want to use the state-of-the-art means, and sometimes it doesn't work. And early in my career, I was a teacher and I taught Head Start for 5 years. And I had a child in my classroom who suffered with, she would get reoccurring cases of lice in her hair or some kind of scalp condition. And her mother had to work. She was a working mother who was also going to school, and she took her to countless doctors and had countless treatments, and nothing seemed to take care of this wingworm condition. And I remember talking to my mother, and my mother called my great aunt and said to her, "What do you use to get rid of wingworm?" And she recommended some soap that we were able to, she actually sent us. And I told the mother, try this soap in her hair, use it 3 times a day, et cetera, make sure her hair is dry, etc. And within a matter of less than, I would say, a week, the child's hair cleared up. Went back to the doctor. The doctor said, "Oh, was it the medicine?" And it wasn't. So I think realizing that there are so much knowledge in communities of color, of different cultures and ethnicities, that we can rely on when it comes to issues such as nutrition, when it comes to issues such as medical treatment, and not denying that they know the way. And perhaps this could lead us. And it's also a matter of making it more comfortable too for the families involved. So I think your point was very well taken. Thank you for that.
Hey, such brilliant points. And we're almost at time. So I feel like that's a great comment to leave on. So a huge thank you to, oh, if you know the name of the soap, definitely let us know. Yeah, so a huge thank you to our 3 panelists, Tanika, Ora, and Kelly, for such an amazing panel. I think we just had such a rich discussion, and I'm really glad that this panel was recorded and it can be shared beyond our circles. I think there were just like so many brilliant points that need to be highlighted, especially as we continue working in our communities and especially in advocacy and policy work.